So, welcome, friends and enemies, to another episode of the Forensic Focus podcast. Tonight we have with us Nick Harvey from Cellebrite, a recent migrator to Cellebrite, and everybody here has heard of Cellebrite because we talked to various people from Cellebrite fairly recently, and you'll have heard about the products a lot. But Nick has come from a police background, and I think he's going to be a very interesting person for us to hear from because of his actual real-world experience of forensics and in some very important sort of concepts in the UK. But I'll let Nick introduce himself, and we'll build from there. So, Nick, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you coming on. Being in the UK, you're actually at the same time as me for a change, which is a nice novelty to be able to hold a conversation in the same time zone. So 8 o'clock at night, and we're going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you and your role now, but how you've gotten to the point you're at.
No, thank you, and thank you for inviting me on. It was a real privilege to be here. That's quite a lengthy question to start with, really, I guess. At the moment, I am a customer success manager at Cellebrite. So essentially, I am responsible for all the post-sales relationship. So actually, once people have got products and I use the Cellebrite tools, is just to make sure actually it's going well, and if they have any issues or difficulties, just to sort of help along with that journey. I started in January, so sort of just under a year ago now. And prior to that, I was in the Metropolitan Police. So I've been I was a detective. I was a detective for just over 16 years in the Met Police, and ended up sort of finishing that part of my journey as a detective inspector, running the county lines team. So sort of the vast majority of my career really was involved in sort of serious organised crime, and that world, that whole sort of covert world, and then moved over, and as I got promoted, was offered an opportunity to look at county lines as a crime type. Met some very, very good people as well, and came up with a very different way of approaching it, a very data-driven way of approaching county lines that ended up being quite successful, and built on it from there. And that was how I sort of finished off my career in the Met.
So forgive me, I mean, I know what county lines are for various sort of reasons because I worked on cases with them, but even the term county is an Englishism. Could you explain to our international audience what the county lines are?
Absolutely. So county lines is a term based off of the English sort of notion of having counties, but realistically what it actually is are when you've got groups, organised sort of networks that are in urban areas. So, for example, London, Birmingham, Liverpool are the sort of biggest exporters in areas. The local marketplaces get saturated, and so in order to continue making more money and earning even more, they will then go and set up shop out in smaller towns and cities around the UK, effectively push out the local drug dealers and take over those areas to expand their business and expand their profits. It's been there in different degrees over the years, but it really then sort of, with the rise of the mobile phone, became even easier for them to operate in this way. So it has really become a major and prominent issue due to the exploitation that takes place around it, because they can sit at the end of a phone, not go and not take any of the risk themselves. They then need other people to go and do that hands-on dealing and take all of that risk around getting arrested or attacked. And therefore they rely on a younger age group that are more naive and effectively get tricked into thinking it's a good idea. And so they end up sending children out into towns and sort of cities across the country on their own with a load of drugs, expect them to take all the risk.
Yeah. And you made an interesting point, and I suspect that this is one of the reasons that Cellebrite were particularly interested to snap you up, was that so much of this particular type of crime is driven by mobiles, it's driven by those communication networks. So you said that you were tackling it in a novel, data-driven way. What can you tell us about that? And
I mean, there's so many cases have been through court now. There's no secret sort of behind it. Essentially, historically, the way that the policing used to deal with it, because it's a very, very difficult thing to tackle. You'd have these young runners out in the counties and in these little towns doing the deals. you'd end up having to follow them and actually conduct surveillance on them to try and work out where they were getting their drugs from and try and work out who was in charge. It felt like a really inefficient way in my previous experience, sort of particularly around sort of firearms and organised crime and all the deals that take place there, is I was always very good at attributing and identifying who was holding a mobile phone. So we just took a very different approach in that by proving that a telephone was being used to deal drugs from, I could show who phone that belonged to. They're guilty of drug dealing. It didn't matter that they weren't present at the location. So we took something that would take a team 4 months to try and conclude one case and shut one county line. I could assign to one member of my team, and they'd have it done in a couple of weeks. So sort of the way that we accelerated that justice process just was exponential compared to where we were, and it obviously resulted in a lot of additional funding from the Home Office, and and it's become quite successful.
Did you find any sort of particular issues in doing it that way? Like, I mean, if you see somebody's car and they've got 3 kilos of drugs in there, they're clearly carrying 3 kilos of drugs, and it's very easy to prove that. With a mobile phone, did you have any? How did you tackle the concepts of sort of attribution of volume and things like that?
That actually was the biggest trouble that we faced straight away. It was quite clear when you were looking at the communications data, less so maybe sometimes than the extraction itself, but the actual calls and text messages going out. Some organisations and some groups are very, very good, a huge enterprise, and some not so much. And we found that there was no real way of distinguishing between them, so everyone was getting the same sort of sentence. I don't really think that's particularly fair, especially if somebody's a bit of a chancer and is just trying to set up and is on their own, and then that's nowhere near the same as an organised group that are exploiting multiple kids and earning a fortune. So we really looked at the patterns behind those messages and patterns behind all of the communications going in and out, and used some health data to work out like how much an average drug user would use a day, and therefore how many people are contacting back, and the whole sort of basically designed a formula behind it that has ended up sort of going through courts and being found to be sort of a reliable method of actually saying, we think at a minimum you've sold this amount of drugs. And yeah, there's been quite a positive reception at the courts and at the Court of Appeal.
Excellent. No, that's really impressive. And I mean, you said you were in the police service for 16 years dealing with organised crime. How has the mobile changed over, and how has the sort of digital forensics landscape changed over those 16 years?
Oh, I mean, a huge amount. When I first started out, a camera phone was a novel concept. So it's completely different. Then you moved on to the iPhones, and then they became encrypted, and everything became harder. It has changed just so dramatically. A mobile phone and the content, you might get a couple of text messages back in the day, or you might get a little bit of call logs. That was about it. So it was really such a tiny part of your job. Now it's so different. I mean, you can tell the story of someone's life based on that phone. You can therefore replace the voice of a victim and the voice of a witness. You can replace them if you've got the right data set, and actually by removing those sort of the more vulnerable from courts is only a good thing. And I mean, the challenges that come along with it obviously are equally as complicated. But I think it's been, an amazing leap forward. Really, is actually, now that we're able to actually use that data properly, and people are getting their heads around it more, because it's taken quite a journey to. A lot of people are still quite sort of, set in their ways and have never used it, and trying to convince them and trying to move that change forwards has left the criminals that little bit of a breathing space up until now. But I think that's really changed recently.
Is that? I mean, he says without wishing to invoke hot fuzz. Is that kind of the issue of Metropolitan Police services versus rural police services in a way, in so much as the cities are obviously I don't want to say better funded, but I think better funded, and therefore get the technology and get the technological help, and the rural services out in rural. I mean, I live in Oxfordshire, so rural Oxfordshire. I'm aware that some of my local towns have certainly shown up in some of the cases that you're talking about. Is that dissemination of information an issue of that sort of relationship with the local police forces, or is it just they haven't gotten to it yet, or how is it that you're able to push out this information?
No, actually, it's pretty good. The communication between forces is a lot better than it used to be. Everything used to be quite sort of isolated and siloed, but no, I was expecting when we first sort of went round to forces, because we were very reliant on that relationship with the towns and cities and in the more rural areas. I was really expecting a lot of resistance, but actually going around and trying to explain the way that we wanted to tackle this problem, actually people were really receptive. They got what we were trying to achieve and were very much on board. I don't. Yes, funding is an issue for some forces. It absolutely is. There's no getting around that. But you've got people that really, really want to make a difference, and that's the biggest battle. And those good people are everywhere. They genuinely are.
Yeah. Good intentions, goodwill, and the hard work go an incredibly long way to making things happen, don't they? It's and as we were talking earlier, just before the podcast recorded, is that generally speaking, in my experience of police officers, is that they are there because they want to be there and making a difference, not because of anything else, and therefore you already have a candidate pool that is advantageously biased in your ability to choose good people to work with. I've had a reasonable amount of experience with some of the things that have come out of, like Operation, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but Venetic?
Venetic, yeah.
Venetic, that's it. It's got an extra E in it. I only ever read it, and I never say it. Obviously that was a huge step forward for law enforcement in the UK. I mean, did you come across and work with any of the data that came out of that?
Yes, yeah. A good friend of mine led that operation for the Met, and we ended up, because it was very data centric and involved a lot of that digital forensics side. My team took on a lot of cases for them. So yeah, we ended up doing quite a large amount of them over the couple of years that we were running that. So no, it was a huge positive step. I mean, though the Encro phones were a massive problem for law enforcement around serious organised crime. But it just had that extra benefit of there were so many people out there that were so far out of away from our radar, that were such key players that just were then exposed, and actually it really gave us a far better understanding of international organised crime than we'd ever had before.
Yes. I mean, obviously the international element of that was critical in its in obtaining the ruse evidence, and but also that it obviously opened up information about the way that stuff was being brought in from overseas to here. We have the advantage of being an island with isolated and not very good growing conditions inside, so it's quite interesting how stuff comes in. Where do you think we're going to head in that? I mean, somebody recently contacted me about a case with something called a Sky ECC handset. Have you come across the other alternatives to EncroPhone, and where do you think we're sort of going to be? Is this going? I mean, it's going to be a constant problem, but I mean, what's your opinion on it?
It is. The good and bad of this technology is it does take away that need to have those face-to-face meetings, and policing was heavily reliant on that sort of surveillance. So in a way, it's going to save us a lot of time once we are able to get into these networks compared to what we used to have to do. But they are always going to look for new ways to try and get around it and use technology in a different way. So I think there's going to be this constant sort of cat and mouse. But I think, as it showed with the Encro phones, they had such confidence in the ability of people they didn't know. It was a company that actually, was incredibly good at it. But they are still then going up against equally smart people from all over the planet that are really determined to find a way around it. And so I think that confidence knock is going to be around for a long time. And yes, Sky ECC is, I'm sure you know, is done. That's not an issue anymore on that one. Yes, they'll replace them, but it's going to keep happening. I mean, that's two major encrypted channels that have both been sort of intercepted and taken out. So it's only going to continue like that. I don't think there's really a place to hide anymore. They do say, don't they? you cannot avoid, digital evidence and digital material interacting in a digital way anymore. So there is no place to hide once you can actually work out a way around that initial security.
And I mean, I think both of these cases threw up some very interesting questions about how we continue to ensure chain of evidence and presentability and robustness of evidence, and making sure it's admissible. Is there sort of a generic way that we can address this better, do you think, or is it just going to really be on a case by case basis where we start to go through the arguments about admissibility and whether it's an intercept or a or whatever it is, or how can we go forward and assure this? And I mean, feel free to cite Cellebrite as a valid way of perhaps ensuring admissibility of data, seeing as you do have bills to pay, and that's a very reasonable thing to do. So but overall, it's admissibility of evidence in such complex scenarios is a real challenge, because it's not only about explaining it to another professional, it's about explaining it to a judge and then to a jury, and I mean, it's challenging.
And you know what, actually, that is the biggest thing, is that you have some very, very bright people that are able to get around this security and actually tackle it. That skill set is very, very different to the one that you need at the other end. And to be able to explain in real simple terms to a judge and to a jury exactly why you can trust that piece of information. What is that piece of information telling me, and why can you trust it? That's a very different skill set, and it's very hard to find people that are very good at both. And I'm not going to put myself in that camp, because believe me, I could not explain to you why that stuff, how technically those things were done. I wouldn't even dream of it. But trying to have that double hat is actually probably the biggest challenge law enforcement has. It's the one skill that I think when it comes to digital forensics experts, they're very, they love their work. The bit that everyone I think needs to work on is that: how do I now explain to someone that doesn't even know what a server is, doesn't know any of these terms? Yeah. Really, really challenging.
Yeah. So, I mean, you implied from that you yourself are not a technical person. Is that fair to say? Okay, I won't add any insult to this.
No, please. I think that's very fair. I take a very different approach to it. Data for me tells a story. It's just, as a detective, I know where I need to go, and I can understand how that story of that data fits into that wider investigation, and I know how to sort of move it forwards in that direction. But actually, the technical bit behind it.
So it's interesting. Have you trained? I mean, either formally or informally yourself as a data scientist? I mean, again, it's a very popular term now to say I'm a data scientist and throw a Python script at something and pretend that the output of it is perfect. So is that something that you yourself have done, or is it you are conceptual and you are asking other people to do this? I mean, detective inspector is a high rank. I mean, I'm assuming you had a fairly large team underneath you to do things at your bidding.
I did. I was very fortunate to have a very good team around me. At the beginning, we didn't, but it was very much I kept a very simple concept, and it is just about, it is that storytelling element at the end. It's all well and good having all this great information, but it's just the ability to then take that and actually demonstrate what is the story that it is telling. And that's the bit that I like, and that's the bit that I was always quite good at. I love communications data. I'm a little bit of a geek when it comes to a pivot table. Some people make fun of me for, but I like that stuff, and I like that. Here's actually the information behind why I can say this is you, or why I can say that you've done this. When it comes down to that real technical, or how did that artifact get on that phone, I will 100% of the time rely on someone far smarter than me to be able to explain that.
I think an interesting thing sort of obviously crops up, and everybody is talking about it, and you'll forgive me because I am incredibly skeptical about this, and therefore the tone may come across very badly. But artificial intelligence which isn't artificial intelligence, it's just machine learning, and it's a lot of applied statistics and algorithms and stuff like that. So it's not really very intelligent. But is this something that you've seen at all come out in anything you've seen yet? I mean, to be fair, you left the Met a year ago, and the biggest noise about it has been in the last year. So it's kind of a little bit after your time in some ways. But do you think it's going to be a significant impact on interpretation of large data sets?
I do. I think there's going to be some, some real positives and some real areas of concern when it comes to artificial intelligence. Certainly, you're already starting to see it where people are using sort of AI tools to generate fake child abuse imagery. That already exists. Thankfully, the law already covers that. That's not an issue. Criminality-wise, though, I can see some big problems coming down the road with it, particularly when you start looking at how much more developed these sort of chatbots are getting. And I don't think it's going to be long before we start seeing that being used as an automated way to begin the grooming process.
Interesting. And do you see it in? I mean, I'd never considered that actually. So that's quite an interesting one. But do you see it in other areas of? I mean, obviously, IIOC and other areas of child abuse is a major concern. But can you envisage a chatbot, doing your drug stealing for you? Is that something else that's an equally realistic proposition, or does it require more human interaction than that?
I think that you've already got the dark web being used in a very transactional way, where you do have somebody sat at the other end just physically taking the orders and sort of like dispatching the orders out. So I don't think it's too much of a leap to say that you can remotely or automate that entire process with someone that you don't someone's not even real. Fraud as well. There's lots of areas I think that's going to happen. But I do think that policing as well can use it in other ways that we're not at the moment. Certainly when you talk about, we've got sort of like, for example, like Pathfinder as a tool with Cellebrite to look at that wider piece of data when you've got multiple data sets coming in. Actually having tools that can look back in time and say, actually, I have this unsolved stabbing from 3 months ago. Let's look through all the new phone downloads we've had since across like the police service and start looking at the location data, start looking at associates and trawling that sort of thing in that far more automated way. I think that it could be used to really help solve crimes in a lot of ways. I don't think it's going to ever replace an officer. I think that's unrealistic, but I do think that it can be used to harness a lot of the data that does already exist, that is just for the volume of it is being overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're 100% right, and the fear mongers out there will be talking about how AI is going to replace people, but the fundamental thing is that it's not intelligent and it's not creative. It's only ever regurgitating something else that's been generated by somebody who is intelligent and creative. And so much of investigative work is based upon creative problem solving as opposed to just data crunching. So yeah, no, I agree with you. I think it's a thing that's that's likely not to ever replace us, but could be massively useful in that. You said that Cellebrite is embracing some tools that are machine learning enabled. He said, I can't do it now. It still sticks in my throat. But machine learning enabled. Can you talk a bit more about what that actually is?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, primarily using it when it comes to the sort of the extraction at the end, because actually most conversations that people have in digital forensics or even phones are about unlocking it and getting the data out. But actually, that's a very small part of that journey. What happens with it at the other end is huge by comparison. And it's that area I can really see that it's going to make a big difference. So we already have tools around media classification. So looking through and actually saying, well, actually, I think that this image looks like a car, or I think this is a number plate and this looks like drugs to me. Conversation sort of patterns around, well, this looks like it's, talking about the police or trying to hide evidence. Those sort of tools are in our tools. And they're really working quite well, and they're really quite popular, and they're things that we're building on sort of over time, and it's those time saving areas is where we're trying to focus that on.
I'm aware of some very interesting research, to be fair, into attacks against machine learning models. Do you have any sort of mitigation against that yet, or is it still new enough as a research concept that it's not quite there yet? And I mean, to be fair, I think the mitigation is that, back to the suggestion that AI should not be replacing us, is that, you know, it should be checked by a human to make sure that whatever the results are out for positive or negative should be verified. But, you know, is this something that you've come across yet?
No, it isn't, and I think that it's one of those areas that's, I imagine, is quite difficult. It's a difficult concept anyway, and you know, the people that are involved at this point in time, I think, are probably unlikely to be the at that criminal end where it's going to become more prevalent in that day-to-day world of offending. I think there's still some time between the two, but you're right. You're talking about people's liberty, or that's on the line. It should be checked. You can't just rely on a tool blindly without actually saying, can I believe what I'm being shown here? Yeah. I think we don't do that enough as a society generally. But
oh yes, yeah. Now that's a topic for a whole another podcast.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. It is brilliant, isn't it? Is we go from a picture is worth 1,000 words when you're at school, to don't believe everything you see, to really question absolutely everything you're seen and told, especially if it comes from a politician. So it really is quite a learning curve for the average person coming into the world. So yeah. So I mean, from how are you enjoying Cellebrite, the life of not being involved on a day-to-day frontline basis, and what's happening for you in the Cellebrite world?
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a transition, really. It's certainly was a lot to get my head around at first. That sort of step out of it's my first real step out into since I was in my early 20s, and sort of I had jobs when I was younger, but not my life has been built around policing, so it has been quite a change. But it's been really good. It's been really nice to see it on the other side, and still being able to have a positive involvement. A lot of what I do is still very much centered on helping those that are still doing that great work out there, and they really are doing some amazing work. And just being able to still use some of my experience to try and help with that process, to make sure that they're getting what they need from us and that we're communicating the right way. I've really actually quite enjoyed it, and seeing it from the other side has been really positive. And Cellebrite have been great with that. There's a lot of people that are from law enforcement backgrounds, and that's got a really nice supportive feel to it. Everyone has felt the way I felt at some point, so it's been a really great sort of transition outside.
Cool. So on a day-to-day basis, are you working with law enforcement? I mean, you work with every Cellebrite customer, but I mean, the majority law enforcement?
Yes, yeah, the vast majority are either, a police force or a three-letter agency of some description. And no, it's been, so that's how most of my day is actually, how can we as Cellebrite help more? What can, are you getting everything that you need? Where are your problems? Where are the bits that you're struggling with? Is there anything that I can do to fill that gap for you? So most of my time is actually spent still in that law enforcement world, and trying to help, which is a great feeling, really. I'm really fortunate to still have that feeling, because that was my biggest concern when I left law enforcement, was that feeling that you are helping and you are doing something is going to fall away, and I still get to. So it's fantastic.
Well, that's brilliant. And I mean, you're taking feature requests and things like that. So when people are coming and saying, oh, crying out loud, WhatsApp's just upgraded again and we can't get anything out of it, that's coming through you back and being fed back into your development teams.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And looking at those feature requests, or just generally of this is the direction that that this particular police force or agency wants to move in. This is what their long-term goal is, right? How can we help shape our products around that? So I get to do a lot of, I get to feedback a lot of positive sort of bits to our development teams and our product teams, and just generally try to help solve those other problems. Sometimes, more than anything else, it is just, did you know our tool can actually do this? Or, have you looked at this particular aspect of it, because that might solve some of your problems, or it might not solve it brilliantly, but actually as an interim we could do this, and then we'll move on to this for you, and try and it's really like a lovely role for me.
No, it sounds fantastic, and it's interesting because we as a forensic professional, we spend thousands of pounds on bits of software, and then probably only use about, well, I'd like to think it's the Pareto principle of 80-20. The reality of it is probably 50-50. But there's always another bit of the software that we've invested into that we've never come across, we haven't learned, or we don't use regularly, that may well actually solve our problems. So somebody who's actually engaging and able to talk to sounds fantastic. So that sounds really, really wonderful. Absolutely. I mean, one thing you sort of alluded to earlier was the idea that Cellebrite's looking at larger, more conceptual data sets now of an unsolved stabbing from 3 months ago, and sort of looking at data that's coming in now. Obviously you seize a phone or whatever. I mean, the volume of data is a huge issue. I mean, it's a huge issue with one phone now, because it's a 128 gig or 256 gig one device. And when you've seized multiple of those in any given raid, plus the computers, plus the PlayStation, plus whatever else you've pulled in, you've got a huge amount of data that you're sifting through. How are you managing to do that on a scale where you're talking historically across a huge amount of such a huge amount of data?
With some very, very talented developers and engineers, if I'm honest. It's that ability just to then bring that all that data in together and actually have those tools that really are designed for investigators. And that's, I think, the biggest change that that I certainly feel really strongly about and am part of, is that there's so much of the digital forensics world at the moment that is very, very process driven, because the volume is just massive coming through the door, and the output is then massive as well. To make that easier, so that effectively forensic units become centres of excellence, get that done, get a lot of that stuff automated, move into, trying to give them that time to actually really help investigators, but investigators need to help themselves. And so those sort of tools where you can bring in all of your extractions into one place for a job, and actually say, right, this is my story, this is, what is that data coming back with? Oh, actually, all of my subjects were together just prior to the offence, and they all were here, and then have moved in this direction. To look through, 8 256 gigabyte app downloads, cross-reference them all, and come up with that is days and days and days of work for an investigator. Having those tools with those very talented people that have been able to do that and bring all that together, and a click of a button can give you those answers. They're the biggest conversations I think that we're now having in digital forensics in the UK. Is, we've got this extraction thing sorted. We are in a good place with it, but the investigators are now where we need to focus our attention on, and that time to evidence piece is something that's really important to us as a company.
So that's effectively the next step in the evolution of forensic technology, is to move it out of the hands of forensic professionals, but into the hands of of investigators, at least in the initial stage of going, oh well, okay, this is interesting, and then handing it back again so that somebody can explain why this means what it means. So that's a very exciting piece. Are you? I mean, you're developing this and you're working on it. You're providing training for all of this stuff on different levels, so I can come along as an investigator, as a DI, and go, I know how to use Excel and do a pivot table, but this is a bit new to me. Can you please show me how to use it? And then you will get that investigative training.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. For me, the biggest thing is first of all that mindset change of not people look at that data and it's really they get daunted by it and it can look really overwhelming. Actually, to say no, what am I trying to achieve? What are my objectives? And let's now reframe that. But no, we do a lot of work with investigators, and certainly actually one of the presentations that I did recently was very much on this topic around that communication with between digital forensics units and the investigators at the other end. And I found it really fascinating actually that because the labs are very process driven because they have to be because of the regulations and everything else they have to comply with, is that it doesn't give them that free time and that headspace to actually have those open lines of communication. So really what I really want to try and work on over the next sort of year personally is help investigators so that they can feel more comfortable going back to the labs and actually asking about specific things and getting that advice and knowing that there are answers in there if they know where to look. Um,
Contentious question for you, and feel free to dodge it and not answer it. But do you feel that the increase in regulation is actually beneficial?
I think I think having oversight of processes is always a good thing. I think that it is important to make sure that when you are producing something that it is accurate because these are people's lives that are on the line. You are not only, you're talking about someone that might be wrongfully imprisoned, but if that ever were to happen, the real person that's done that harm to that individual is also then out to do that again to somebody else. It's really important, I think, to make sure that we get it right. And therefore having that oversight is a good thing. I am a little concerned that that process has swung too far. Um, and I think that there does need to be that sort of that balance of that regulation and sort of some of the structure behind it. Um, you know, we have a lab, for example, in London where we have to validate and verify all our tools are accurate and everything else, and we go through the same process with UCAS that every force does. But yet, our work can't be transferred to another force, so they're having to employ people and take them away from investigating, solving crime to just do the same administrative tasks that we've already demonstrated are
Yeah.
accurate. Yeah, I think that there does need to be a new balance, and let alone how any defence team are going to be able, and any I can't see how a defence expert is going to be able to comply with the level of scrutiny and sort of the all of the rules. So actually, you're not denying defence justice as well in some way. If they can never find someone that can comply and we're able to, be able to do this work and be able to check over the work that's been done, where does that leave a defendant? And I think that that's perhaps forgotten as well.
Yes, I mean that's certainly the viewpoint that I have is that it, given that its prosecution labs are generally better set up, better funded, and larger than defence individuals, this is an incredibly biased a biased thing. It's interesting actually because I came to forensics after having a background in security, and we used to have something which was called the what was it, EAL. I can remember the initials, but I can't remember what it actually stands for. It was an evaluation criteria set that was used it was used internationally, and it was actually done by the US government, and they EAL evaluated something to a number. But if it was EAL 4+, you could use it for top secret stuff, and it was already evaluated that way. And it's reasonable to say, okay, well, Cellebrite is evaluated to, do X process, and therefore, we can assume that to be true. I mean, it puts a lot of onus on you guys to make sure that your accreditation and everything is up to date, and it's an incredibly expensive process. But it does ease the onus on everybody else, yeah.
And public money. You have each of the digital labs for each government, police force, and organisation having to hire people dedicated full time to do this work
Yeah,
when it's been done 43 different times over by every force and us.
yeah,
And obviously, all of our competitors are in exactly the same boat and they've all been doing it too. And it's a
yeah,
lot of duplication. And that's a lot of public money that's being spent.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Shame. So I mean, what just sort of we'll close out in a second. But as a parting shot, what advice would you give to either? Well, actually, no. Let's stick with this one. What advice would you give to a DI who is coming to this sort of technology fresh now? They are where you used to be, and it's starting to dawn on them that this is a data source that can be mined for a lot of information and some successful prosecutions. What advice would you give over it when you were there? What do you wish you knew?
Don't be afraid of just giving it a go sometimes, I think, and actually seeing what's out there and what can be achieved. A lot of processes and a lot of ways of working have existed because of the data and the technology at the time. That changes very quickly. So don't ever be afraid to turn around and think, actually, what if I tried it this way and just actually take a different approach to something. Certainly that's what we did with that sort of time to evidence. Mobile phone extractions, because of the heavy processes involved for my unit, we were turning over so much work so quickly that we would have drowned the Met Police's digital unit. We would have drowned it with the amount of phone downloads we were going to be putting in. So I set up my own lab with a very different sort of spin on it, so that we weren't ever taking any material to court that hadn't been through the lab officially and hadn't gone through the proper channels. But I worked out only 4% of my phone downloads. We had such a good early guilty plea rate. Only 4% of my phone downloads actually ever saw a courtroom. So why did I need to get real experts that are excellent at their work looking at my other 96% of that and flooding them and overloading them? And so it's those just different approaches, is that look at what you actually are trying to achieve and what you really need, because there are so many options out there. If you are, if you take that step back and say, actually, I know this is the way we do things, but why?
Yeah. So what do you actually need to tell the story that you want to convey, and then go and find that rather than follow the the traditional methodology to get there?
Yeah.
Ah, excellent piece of advice. That's fantastic. Well, I'm gonna close it out here. We've been chatting for about 45 minutes, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, and taking the time to talk to us. For the listeners, you can find us on all places that good podcasts can be found. So Spotify, YouTube. You can come on to our own website. This podcast will be transcripted, so if you're hard of hearing, you're not listening to this, but you will be reading the transcript, so you know what I'm saying about that. You can read it. But anyway, we'll not worry about these minor technical details. It's like time travel. I can never remember what the point of all of these things is. So, again, Nick, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Do please arrange with us to come back and tell us about this exciting thing that's going to happen in January. In mid-January, because I really want to know what it is now, and that would be wonderful to catch up. It's been fascinating talking to you about it, and just from a personal perspective, thank you very much for the work on the county lines. I mean, it's a serious problem in the UK, and you think that living out in the countryside that you might be sort of a little safer from these things, but the reality is somewhat different, and it's nice to know that people are taking such care of it and really following up and making it making a difference to make it that way. So I really appreciate that. But thank you very much for joining us. I will say goodbye, and goodbye to all the listeners, and let you go back to your evening.
Right, thank you for inviting me on.
A pleasure.